ANANYA Roy, it's a great thrill. It's been for Crystal and me and the rest of us to have you here for most of this week and joining in some events with the InfUr Hub, which you know seeks to bring together a range of research approaches and critiques across the disciplines from architecture, urban design and urban planning, and across a range of different kind of informal practices and their intersections with formality in the city. So we'll start with some questions about the nature of urban informality, which you've been such a key voice in theorising. You've initiated a critique of urban informality as a mode of urbanisation where the focus is on the state's power to control states of exception and to establish which kinds of informality will be targeted for erasure, such as slums, and where a blind eye will be turned, such as middle-class informality. You've argued that informality must be understood not as the object of state regulation, but as produced by the state itself. Does this imply that this mode of urbanisation is produced by the state in the first instance? And how does that sit with the view that the city is older than the nation state, and that informality is also a normal aspect of urban life that the state seeks then to formalise?
Well, first, I want to thank you and Crystal for the invitation to be here at Melbourne this week. It's been absolutely wonderful to spend time with faculty and students and to learn more about the work happening here. And it's a pleasure to return to conversations around urban informality with some depth and debate. Yesterday, in the conversations with doctoral students that Crystal moderated and curated, we had a lively discussion around the role of the state in relation to urban informality. And in many ways, in my earlier work and now, I continue to argue that we have to centre the role of the state as we think about urban informality. And that in particular, as you noted, Kim, I've argued that urban informality cannot be seen as a bounded sector that exists outside of state regulation. I'm not even convinced that deregulation fully captures the modes of production and control through which urban informality is governed. So one can argue, in fact, that it is the state that produces urban informality by designating what is formal and what is not. In some senses, the designation of legality and formality, for me, is an important site of inquiry. Why are some spatial practices designated as formal, whether it be through a master plan or some other means, while other practices are designated as illegal? This also means that we have to very carefully theorize the state. So the state, as I have thought about it in relation to urban informality, particularly in the case of Kolkata, is not just the formal apparatus of city government or metropolitan administration, but it is also the broader context of political power. It is the formation of political parties. It is its extension into civil society, and it is not necessarily the nation state. I think it is very interesting to think about the role of the nation state and multiple scales of the state in the context of urban informality, but I've been primarily interested in what perhaps others would call urban governance.
Okay, you've also said that it's that informality is not a pre-capitalist relic or an icon of backward economies. It's rather a capitalist mode of production par excellence, right? So if we understand a capitalist mode of production as one where the means of production are owned and controlled by a ruling class, how does this apply to informal production?
So I think that urban informality, and particularly urban informality in the realms of work and housing, but I would argue transportation as well, can be seen very much as a particular governance of labor relations. It can also be seen as a particular governance of land relations. So the articulation of land and labor through informality makes possible particular sorts of exploitation, makes possible certain sorts of expropriation of land. It makes possible a certain logic of valorizing land that is otherwise not seen to be valuable. So in many parts of the world, and this is an argument that Manuel Castells made decades ago, we have informal settlements that are established, whether it be through political party bosses or other means, often through landlords who control land. These informal settlements are established in parts of the city that are not seen to be valuable residential land, but it is through that act of settlement that the frontier of development expands. So in fact, informal settlements have often been the first frontier of urban development, and then at some point they are demolished and make way for what are often more formal settlements.
Okay. You've also written with approval of Apadrai's notion of deep democracy and of Bayat's celebration of quiet encroachment and some of those kind of writings that valorise the value of self-organisation, of developing the existing knowledge and skill of the urban poor through what is often called a governmentality from below. Mm-hmm. Yet you also criticise the heroic entrepreneurship model of De Soto and others and warn about romanticising the agency of the urban poor. So how can we celebrate self-organised insurgency without romance?
I would argue that I have engaged with those ideas rather than celebrated them. So I think that the collection of ideas that I have called subaltern urbanism remains an important contribution to our understandings of urban life in the global south and north. And that includes Apadrai's notion of deep democracy, Chatterjee's notion of political society, Benjamin's notion of occupancy urbanism, Asif Bayat's notion of quiet encroachment. But for me, those processes are, of course, structurally related to that mode of production of space that I'm calling urban informality. So the self-organization or the sort of governmentality from below or counter-governmentality that some of these theorists are talking about exists in the context of a very specific political economy of land and power that we've got to take careful note of. And that becomes very evident in the examples used by all of these theorists. So if we take Apadrai's deep democracy, which is in the context of various NGOs, including a federation of the urban poor in Mumbai, that collection of organizations was embedded in a political economy that repeatedly evicted and demolished informal settlements. So while that deep democracy, including self-enumeration and counter maps and surveys conducted by pavement dwellers were vitally important, ultimately they were not robust enough to stand up to the sweeping evictions and demolitions that arrived in Mumbai, led by powerful elitist NGOs, what came to be called the Shanghaification of Mumbai. And one of the ironies then is the ways in which some of these mediating organizations often deploy the idea of informality in order to continue what I would argue are quite exploitative practices. In the example that Apadrai gives of Spark, Spark pioneered the idea of voluntary resettlement. I mean, that to me is a pretty poignant paradox, where the idea was that the urban poor would dismantle their own settlements and negotiate resettlement with city governments and move elsewhere without asserting the right to remain, without asserting the right to stay, without undertaking what I would argue would be more militant forms of action. So in fact, deep democracy involves a certain logic of informality that can be quite exploitative.
Right. Okay. The word slum is widely used to refer to and to measure substandard urban conditions, but also criticised by those such as Gilbert, Main and others as a word that casts a slur on populations who live in those conditions. The phrase informal settlement is widely used as a euphemism. Can and should the S word be avoided, as Mike Davis puts it? And is informal settlement a useful synonym?
That's a wonderful question. I think the term slum, for me, is a stark reminder that urban informality is produced through state power and state violence. A slum is a slum because the government has stated that it is a slum. So what I find useful about the use of the term slum is precisely that reminder that this is a designation, and perhaps arbitrary designation, by state power, by planning power. I worry at times that the term informal settlement doesn't carry that same kind of reminder. And whether we're using slum or squatter settlement or informal subdivision, for me, all of these terms remain inadequate. I use them, but they remain somewhat inadequate because I don't think they fully capture the variegation and complexity of informal habitation and particularly of informal land markets. So in India, there are other terms in use. The term basti is often used, and basti is perhaps a more interesting term because it connotes residence in the city, a settlement. And it is perhaps has come to be associated with informality, but it need not be so. And it clearly doesn't have the stigma that is associated with slum. But I actually would argue that I find the term slum very convenient and useful. I also like that it bridges global south and north and reminds us of these transnational ideas of spatial order that have been central to modern urban planning.
Right. Okay. I want to ask about temporary and tactical urbanism, the kind of transformations of public space through what is variously known as temporary or tactical urbanism has become a popular theme in many global north cities, sometimes called guerrilla urbanism, do-it-yourself urbanism, pop-up urbanism. And such projects are variously critiqued as bringing innovation, experimentation and agility to an over-formalised city on one hand, or as vectors of gentrification, neoliberal planning and austerity urbanism on the other. Do you have any views on this?
Well, I think both can be true, that I think tactical urbanism can be a powerful appropriation of space by those otherwise excluded and marginalized. And it can also be part of creative city making and a set of design practices that set the stage for gentrification. So I think it very much depends on what kind of tactical urbanism we're looking at and who is able to enact those tactics. When I think of tactics, I think very much, of course, of the work of Michel de Certeau and the distinction he makes in the practice of everyday life between strategies and tactics. And he talks about strategies following Foucault as the political economy of the proper place. And I find that to be a wonderful phrase and idea of who puts us in place, keeps us in place, what is one's proper place, what is the political economy of that proper place. And for him, tactics are precisely those that disrupt that political economy of proper place. So I find that an interesting approach to the notion of tactics. And this, of course, takes us back to Asif Bayat's work. And he, of course, in turn is relying on James Scott's notion of weapons of the weak and thinking very much about quiet encroachment as weapons of the weak expressed spatially, and that some of those tactics might not even be collective, but nevertheless have a collective effect on space.
So is this kind of antinomy, or this antinomous quality of being both potentially good and bad, of this tension that's there in temporary tactical urbanism in the global north, is that similar in your view to the ways in which some kinds of informality play out, like in informal street trading in the global south?
Well, I think that the question is whether tactics are sufficient to stake claims to space, whether tactics are sufficient to stake a right to the city. I think tactics are essential. So one of the things I've been thinking quite a bit about is what that through line is between what we would consider to be tactics and then more spectacular forms of collective action. And this is where the worldwide Occupy movement are very instructive. That in many ways, the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, and other forms of Occupy seemed to suddenly emerge, and they transformed cities. They transformed our imaginations of what could take place in urban public space. And they sort of harkened back to earlier moments of urban barricades and mobilizations. But as Asad Bayat and others have shown, say in the case of Cairo, the occupation of something like Tahrir Square didn't just happen. It built on a long legacy of what we might call tactical urbanism, of various ways in which the urban subaltern had already staked these minor claims to space, right? And it was then became sort of a cross-class coalition that seemingly overnight took over a massive public space. So I'm very interested in, as I noted, these through lines in the ways in which there might be a sedimentation. There might even be ways of remembering what are otherwise fleeting forms of tactical urbanism and how they might build a repertoire then of resistance and protest in cities.
Okay, that's in some ways a nice bridge to talking about the professions a little bit. You've been fairly critical in the past of architectural responses to informality, particularly the aestheticization of poverty, what you called a pastoral nostalgia, that sees informal settlement as a kind of vernacular architecture and a form of symbolic capital. You suggest that designers often embody an ideology of space and an environmental determinism that excludes critiques of power. You've also spoken of recasting what design is through critical design thinking. But most of what passes for critical architecture involves a reduction of architecture to discourse, buildings that talk about power rather than anything else. Do you have examples of where architects have or could make a contribution, or how do you see the architecture profession in this field?
So it's always a privilege to be able to comment on a discipline and profession that is not one's own. I've been similarly critical, as you both know, of urban planning. My concern, whether it's architecture, urban design, or urban planning, has been precisely, as you pointed out, the ways in which the informal has been turned into a romanticized picture, a speaking picture almost, that represents the traditional, the vernacular, the pre-capitalist, the peasant. Something to be recuperated, preserved, monumentalized, perhaps upgraded through some beautification. And I felt that this has elided that political economy of land and power that we've been talking about, and that it can also have quite dangerous consequences for the lived experiences of informality. There are, of course, spatial thinkers, including architects, who have taken a more critical approach to informality. And in the US context, I like thinking of the work of Terry Crews at the US-Mexico border, because while he is very, very optimistic about this energy from below, right? The border is inherently porous, as the incredible crossing of borders, of bodies and material across the border, creating a transnational informal urbanism. He situates it within the violence of US imperialism, within the violence of a highly exclusionary urban environment, where he talks about San Diego as the world's largest gated community, and Tijuana is right up against that gate. And in that context, he situates his work then in community organizations and in communities that are constantly battling the border. So I think that is one way to celebrate that self-organization of space without aestheticizing it. I think the other role that I would like to see architects play, particularly in the city that I now call home, City of Angels, Los Angeles, is around something that architects were involved with in the early 20th century, which is housing, social housing. If one thinks about the sort of high modernist period, and one thinks about sort of the urban imaginations of architecture, and there's a lot to critique there. But one key aspect of that imagination had to do with housing and had to do with the state's role in housing. And it would be quite welcome, I think, to have architects who play an important public role in what are urgently needed debates about the housing question and the role of the state.
Just to follow up, the number one global architecture prize, the Pritzker Prize, has been given twice in recent years to architects who have engaged with issues of informality in the global south. Aravina and Doshi. Do you know about this? And are they, who are, in a sense, building partial houses that are to be completed by informal means? Do you have any comment on that?
Yes, as one of the PhD students reminded me yesterday, my past work has been critical of Charles Correa, of Doshi. I think elite Indian architects, in a manner similar to Hassan Fathi in Egypt, have again imagined informal settlements as a vernacular environment. They've imagined this as self-built housing, right? There is some amount of self-construction, of auto-construction, as my Brazilian colleagues would put it, but the key dynamics of informal settlements in India is not the auto-construction. The key dynamics is the very complex political economy of land, particularly of tenancy and subtenancy. So in other words, the issue here becomes how we see the slum. And we often see the slum as a set of small plots of land where individual households have built auto-constructed dwellings on this. And somehow the architect then imagines an upgrading scheme where there can be some services and there can be the possibility of improving that auto-construction. That is not how a slum is built. It's not how it functions. And so for me, these are quite picturesque and quaint ways of dealing with the informal.
Okay, Crystal?
I guess this is where I come in. And similar to Kim, I'm interested in asking a practice discipline-focused question, and in this case, about urban planning. So yesterday during the PhD workshop, you asserted that urban planning has made itself irrelevant to addressing some of the biggest challenges, including climate, social, spatial justice. Where might a renewed relevance be found, and how might we inspire or galvanize the next generation of planners and PhD students to be bolder and more courageous in their pursuit of taking on these challenges?
Yes, so for a few years now, I've been arguing that if one is to think about the big public policy issues of the day, which in the United States at the moment would perhaps be three, one of them being climate justice, a second being racial justice, which ranges from mass incarceration to police killings to persistent segregation. And the third would be poverty. and particularly wealth and income inequality, it's quite striking to me that urban planning scholars are not at the forefront of these debates. They are not the public intellectuals shaping these debates, and yet what we are concerned with in urban planning should train us and prepare us to lead the way on these debates. And that has been a lament of mine for a while. And I worry that that urban planning research and urban planning scholarship has not been ambitious enough to take on these big public policy issues, that we have framed our research strategies or our theoretical strategies in ways that perhaps disempowers us from being key public intellectuals. And the contrast here would be with economics. It is striking to me that the public debate on reparations in the United States today is being led by economists. So there is a way in which economics as a hegemonic, some would say colonizing discipline, feels very comfortable taking on the big social issues of the day and sort of recasting it in terms of economics. And I'm not suggesting we should do that, but I do think urban planning has an important role to play, and this is particularly the case because so many of these issues are articulated in space, whether we see that spatiality as something called the city or not.
So just to follow up on that, you speak about the wider political economy of a discipline, so like urban planning. Are there wider forces, or have we done it to ourselves? Have we disciplined ourselves or silenced ourselves in our efforts to do all that, to become relevant in some of these big debates?
So there's a dear friend and colleague of mine at UCLA, Helga Leitner, who's a geographer, and she reminds me that our disciplines discipline us, but we also in turn constitute our disciplines. So I do think that there were earlier moments in urban planning of big thinking. And John Friedman, who connects the University of Melbourne to UCLA, is a wonderful example of that. And one can think about several others. And I think that it is instructive to think about the sorts of work that someone like John Friedman considered to be planning. So I think one of the ways in which we've disciplined ourselves, and I see this in the US, in professional planning associations and conferences, I see it in the European schools of planning, I see it in terms of what courses we teach, I see it in terms of which PhD topics we consider to be planning. There is incredible policing of what is and is not planning. And this confounds me, because this is not to say that everything should fall within the realm of planning, but there is quite a bit that gets pushed out of planning, saying, well, this isn't planning. This is critical urban theory, right? Or this is feminist thought, or this is urban political ecology. And so I think this question of what constitutes the bounds of planning has been a key way in which we have disciplined ourselves, and I would argue narrowed our realms of inquiry.
Thank you. I'm going to now try to make that connection around how we've disciplined ourselves and what constitutes the bounds of planning by going into a question about pedagogy and methodology, if I can. I'm really taken by your engagement with this idea of research justice as a normative positionality that can shape urban scholars and as an idea that they might bring into their research, into their teaching. So in your view, what are some of the methodological practices or teaching pedagogies you feel are changing or challenging how we as researchers work with, observe, or study grassroots groups and their movements as they ever evolve?
So I've been delighted that we've had really robust conversations about research justice here at the University of Melbourne this week. And it is, as I noted, for me and for the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, a normative horizon. Not something that I feel we can achieve, but one that we must constantly strive towards. And I think it is very important to connect research justice to the question of planning pedagogy. So two things. One, master students in urban planning, for the most part, still do what we at UCLA call capstone projects. These are client-based projects. And I think that, as a key part of planning pedagogy, is also necessarily a space where we have to think about research justice. Because, of course, the immediate accountability is to the client who signs off on that client report. But is there a broader accountability? And if so, then to whom? Planning, has, as a profession, has a loose code of ethics. But I think it behooves us, particularly as planning scholars, to think about what codes of ethics should guide the client-centered work that our students do as a key component of planning pedagogy. The other piece of it for me is how these questions of research justice might in fact enter into our core curriculum. I get to teach the Histories and Theories of Planning course at UCLA each fall. It's a course that all of our master's students and first-year PhD students take. And there are usually about 80 or 90 graduate students in it. And that course gives me the occasion each year to think about what I consider to be not only the canon of history and theory, but also all of the various forms of thought that I see as absolutely crucial in disrupting the canon. But this year, I want to take it a step further. And I want students to think about how the knowledge they produce in this class is not just in relation to the canon, but is a relationship between them as students entering the discipline of planning, the canon, and the disruptions of the canon, and then community-centered knowledge. So we are going to partner with the Southern California Library, which is a wonderful community and working class library in the Harvard Park neighborhood of LA. One of the most stigmatized, criminalized police neighborhoods in the city. The library director of the Southern California Library was an activist in residence at the Institute on Inequality and Democracy. So we've collaborated on creating an assignment for this core planning class where students are going to have to do a public history essay on an untold subaltern history in Los Angeles, but they have to prepare it for the community residents who use that library and for the high school teachers who often turn to that library to prepare material for students who go to school in some of the most policed and racially segregated schools in Los Angeles. So that to me is one small step towards research justice, to think about what public history might be, what the community archives might be, and how we contribute to building that, but with a form of accountability in this case to a node of knowledge that is not the university and is not the planning professional discipline.
Sounds like an incredibly immersive experience, and the highlighting of the word accountability is quite striking. Thank you for that. I know Kim has a methods question as well.
Yeah, I'd like to take it to the broader issues. Stolper and Scott wrote a very provocative paper to which you responded, where they had criticised and done a critique of postcolonial approaches and assemblage approaches in urban studies, where they largely conflated postcolonialism with assemblage. I'm wondering how you see the similarities and differences between those two approaches.
So I think that there are a range of interesting frameworks at work at the moment in urban studies. Assemblage is clearly one of them. There is, of course, planetary urbanization that Scott and Stolper have also critiqued. And then there is what one might call postcolonial urbanism, sometimes talked about also as the southern turn. And I think each does a different kind of work. So for me, planetary urbanization is an effort to think about what, in less fashionable terms, I would call the urban and its hinterlands. And I'm sure Neil Brennan and Christian Schmidt would not like that recasting of it, because the ways in which they talk about it is much more exciting. For me, assemblage is a way very much of thinking beyond structure and agency and thinking about a dynamic understanding of materiality. What postcolonial urbanism and the sort of southern turn has tried to do is think about the epistemological basis of our categories, and in particular to think about how Eurocentrism has limited our conceptual understandings of various processes.
So are these different approaches in synergy, or are they in tension in your understanding?
I think they can very much be in synergy. So if we were to think about someone like Colin McFarlane and his work on assemblage, I would argue that Colin is very much an assemblage thinker and has been from the early years of these debates, but is also very much a postcolonial urbanist who thinks about a non-Eurocentric approach to the urban.
Is there a sense in which postcolonialism is more derived from a Derridean philosophical perspective, where assemblage is more derived from a Deleuzean perspective? Because they're very different approaches, aren't they?
Possibly. I would say that, I think that each of these frameworks carry within it quite varied citationary structures. So with postcolonial urbanism, while there is a line of thinking that relies on Derrida, and particularly Derrida following Spivak, I think there are also many other lines of thought in there, be it those that rely on Said, that rely directly on subaltern studies, that rely on forms of decolonial thinking from Latin America. And similarly, I think assemblage thinking, while of course the influence of Deleuze has been strong, I think that there are other forms of post-structuralist thought that make their way into assemblage thinking.
Zooming down a little bit, I wanted to talk about mapping. You've talked about the concept of unmapping, which I understand as highlighting the role of illegibility, of ambiguity, of invisibility in practices of power. As you put it, illegibility is the point.
Right.
It produces flexibility. Yet the map you showed in your lecture of where one may sleep in a car in LA is quite an exact discourse that works as a technology of racial banishment. Yeah. Do you have any comment on the role of mapping as a practice of power, whether it's used by the state, used by the subaltern or the resident? And is there a role for mapping as a production of spatial knowledge in research?
I have a lot to say on this point because we just finished a radical summer school on methodologies for housing justice. And the question of mapping is central to the work we're doing in this new global network. The map that I showed of these green zones in Los Angeles where one is allowed to dwell in one's vehicle for certain hours of the day is precisely the sort of unmapping that I've talked about before. So it's a map. It shows green zones. What it doesn't show us is that those green zones are not really green zones, that they're bound up in a series of parking restrictions and often require residential parking permits that one cannot obtain unless one is, in fact, a renter or a homeowner in those neighborhoods. So in many ways, that map can be seen as a certain performativity of state power, but also creates a sort of illegibility around where one has rights and claims. So my interest in unmapping goes back to sort of this notion of how power is exercised through visibility and legibility, the notion of seeing like a state, and what the state makes visible. And I think what I found very striking, whether it be in India or whether it be now in Los Angeles, are all of the things that are not counted, recorded, enumerated, and mapped. So we know, for example, in the US that we are in the midst of an evictions crisis, sweeping evictions in cities, what the newspapers regularly call the evictions epidemic. Yet, there is no national database on evictions. At the city level in Los Angeles, it is near impossible to collect data on evictions, to enumerate evictions, let alone map them. The counter-mapping work is taking place through brilliant advocacy organizations, as there's one in particular that I want to make note of. For me, they're the best data visualization, data collection, storytelling project in the United States at the moment. Is something called the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project that emerged in San Francisco. There's now a Los Angeles chapter and a New York chapter. I particularly love the fact that they were founded by women graduate students. They continue to be led by women graduate students at UCLA and elsewhere in the UC system. And what they've been able to do is to use the public records request process to collect data, but also combine mapping, and they do very powerful forms of mapping, with oral histories and sort of the production of ethnographic data in order to produce maps that begin to demonstrate evictions and dispossession and displacement. So I think countermapping is a powerful tool. It is absolutely crucial, but it is constantly having to counter the logic of unmapping and illegibility. And the evictions piece, which is very much on my mind in Los Angeles, because we do not have a map that can really tell us about the scale and scope of formal evictions, let alone informal evictions, is one example of that.
So my question is next. One of the things that's really evocative across your work is your challenge to us to see the unseen. And so a large part of your work has been to unsettle theories of urban, the structures that produce the urban, and the way we know those structures. You also talk about the political life and the political economy of urban studies at large. What directions and pathways do you feel critical urban theory and theorists need to take in order to theorize the contemporary challenges of today, like climate change would be an example? How might we see these problems differently or unsee our dominant biases and conceptions about them?
So I think that there is, of course, really important and exciting work happening in so many realms of urban studies. My current interest is around returning to old ideas of justice and thinking about the role of urban studies. And within urban studies, I would place planning, etc. And thinking about the role that urban studies has to play in justice struggles, but in building justice as a field of inquiry. So what I mean by this is in the work we're doing at UCLA, we quite deliberately called our new endeavor and this global network Housing Justice in Unequal Cities, rather than the housing crisis. Because we think that while we are, of course, at a moment of sustained housing crisis, we're also at a moment of a very exciting proliferation of movements, forms of organizing, new imaginations of property, land, shelter, housing. And for me, the next step in urban studies, but it might be, in fact, a return to sort of a much older version of urban studies, is to think about how housing justice, in this case, can be consolidated as a field of inquiry. In other words, what we have at the moment in urban studies, including in our top journals, is what is often seen to be an array of exciting case studies about movements and struggles in different parts of the world. Oh, wow, there was a rent strike in LA. Or how fantastic, there's a referendum that comes up next year in Berlin. Or look what Barcelona just did. And these continue to be seen as almost anecdotal, as points on a map. So my hope is that the next round of grand theorization will really think about the connections across these and think about how these struggles on the ground actually allow us to conceptualize in very rich ways spatial justice, whether that be climate justice or housing justice. So that is my own particular wish list for urban studies and sort of the next step to sort of creating a new vocabulary, if you will, of justice, and thinking about how many of these movements are giving new meaning to old ideas, be it the idea of the commons, be it the idea of tenancy, be it the idea of property.
Thank you, Ananya. Thank you.
Can I just have one capping question?
Yes.
How do you... There's a fair bit of data around that suggests that, particularly in places like China, that we have managed to haul large populations out of poverty over recent decades. How optimistic are you for the future in that context of issues of global poverty and inequality?
So the story of global poverty is an interesting one. In my past life, particularly at UC Berkeley, I spent a lot of time thinking about regimes of international development and about global poverty in particular as a problem that was managed and governed and regulated through the Millennium Development Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals and so forth. So it's quite clear that there have been drops in world poverty since 2000, since the ratification of the MDGs. Much of those drops in world poverty can be attributed to drops in poverty in China. And yet, the geography of global poverty is an interesting one. So yes, there have been drops in poverty in China, but there have also been stark increases in inequality in China. And some of that inequality is, of course, spatialized and is maintained through spatial mechanisms such as the hukou system. The other part of the global geography of poverty has to do with how poverty is now concentrated in what we would consider to be middle-income democratic countries, such as India. India has one of the world's largest concentrations of poverty and extreme poverty. And that has accompanied high economic growth rates. And it has accompanied what have been very significant victories around rights, be it the right to healthcare or the right to education. And so it takes me back to the puzzle that is at the very heart of the Institute on Inequality and Democracy. When we first launched the Institute in 2016, we had to think a lot about the "and" that connected inequality and democracy. It was tempting to think about democracy as the antidote to inequality. And of course, we knew that that was not the case. So we have been thinking very much about how inequality is reproduced and often even deepened in liberal democracies using democratic means. So many of the forms of state-organized violence that I talk about are the democratic means of state power.
So is there an optimism there or not?
The optimism for me has to do with how these forms of inequality and these concentrations of poverty cannot be sustained, that there is perhaps no form of state power that can gloss over these inequalities, that can maintain them. And I think that while these are difficult times, for example, in the United States and even in a city like Los Angeles, it is also a moment of tremendous mobilization, a moment of tremendous collective action. I think that, as I noted earlier in my response to Crystal's question, we can do a better job as academics of honoring those forms of mobilization, of theorizing them, and thinking about how they, in turn, produce new meanings of democracy and equality for all of us.
That's a good place to stop. Thank you very much, Anannya.
Thank you both.
Thank you.